Here is Sailor Studio 273. Now, this is actually a brown pink. So it's going to be in brown, but it's kind of a brownish pink that simply looks more like a diluted light tone of brown. Unlike the swatch that was really to make you think it's kind of a magenta, the chromatography shows that it is a light brown for sure. This consistently stays a light brown across different papers and always shades well. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs just as well as it does on the premium stuff. Sometimes I generally expect the most of, or it's something that I generally expect the most of with Sailor inks, that they should be very consistent. I see this as a great pen pal ink, making beautiful correspondence, especially when combined with the right paper, but not a good ink for important notes because it can get very light on the page.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M805. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here is that very light brown that we're seeing. Now we can read it. It's a beautiful tone. It almost makes me feel like I was actually writing with kind of a condensed T. But again, we can see important notes, probably not the best option. No feather, no spread, great shading. You see the constant shift back and forth between lighter and darker letters. I think it's obvious looking at it why it's a good choice for correspondence, not a good choice for, your most important notes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Sakura Mori. Here is Sailor Bungabox Norwegian Wood. Here is Sailor Kobe number 11. Here is Sailor Bungabox 4B.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
This to me looks just a little bit lighter than it does on the Clairfontaine, though it's within the realm of all of the shading that we had there. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade very well, allows you to see many of the parts much easier. Take a look at allows on the first line. That A is incredibly light. Now the bottom of the L's are darker than the top of the L's. Lightens up into the OW, but the S at the end does get darker. Would this be the greatest ink to be running around town to jot down, don't forget to go here? No. Use it for those letters. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, I kind of expected to see some tone shift from this with it being so incredibly light. It just means that even with it being very light, then, the tone of the paper isn't what's going to change the tone of the ink. It's the makeup of the paper itself. This does not feather, does not spread, does shade, not as well as on the Clairfontaine, but still very well. I would not go with this tone of paper for correspondence because this does seem just a little harder to read than it does on white. I'd probably go for an ivory paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, It does not stand out from those quad rules. It is doing horribly in this case. I see the quad over the writing, and that would be much more than just a distraction to me. I would not use this if quad rule is what you tend to go for. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more brown inks. Here is Califolio Sepia. Here is Delta Brown. Here is Diamine Ancient Copper.
Here is Vinta Heritage Brown Panama.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is a little bit lighter, a little bit flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather, does not spread, still shades very well. It being lighter and flatter makes it harder to read, especially with this quad rule. If you were a student using this to take important notes in your lab notebook, I would probably have to take some corrective action with you about your ink choice here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Geherbon Rose Cyclamon. Here is Noodler's Grün Cactus. Here is Robert Oster Red Orange. Here is Parker Quink Permanent Blue Black. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is quite a bit lighter than we were seeing on the Clairfontaine. Really dull as a tone on this paper. It doesn't feather. It has minor spread that's going on. It does shade, which I guess would be really good. Really pretty okay. I wouldn't use this for work. If I was writing on this for correspondence, it would be perfectly fine. That's where I'm going to leave this ink here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. You could write on both sides in your notes. Now, I am not oblivious to these tiny little spots that occur, but it is such a light ink, and those spots are really not a problem, that I think if you were using this for correspondence sake, it would be fine.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet broad of the Pelikan M805 gives us likely the darkest tone and very nice shading on a pretty consistent basis. Off camera, for a brief period of torture, I tried this in a medium to dry flow medium nib, and as expected, it lightened up for a excruciating reading experience. But part of this had to do with the thinner line, making it even harder to read. For this reason, I don't think it's actually the nib size that matters as much as the flow of the pen. Go for a gusher of a pen to get the tone and shading seen in the writing sample. I don't believe it's the nib size, it's the wetness of that pen. Gusher.